Hi, welcome everyone. I'm Dennis Fisher, and with me today is Ariana Mirian from our Census research team. We're going to talk about some super cool research that Ariana has done on non standard ports and where to find them. Ariana, thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, Dennis, thanks for having me on. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. So you sent me this research a few weeks ago and said, "Is this something? Like, do you think it's interesting?" I was like, "Yeah, I think it's really interesting." And the thing that jumped out at me, first of all, is when I look at something like that and think, okay, you're looking at all these protocols that you would normally find on a set port or, sort of like one offset from, say, port 80
Yeah,
for HTTP. Maybe you'll
yeah,
find it on 81, maybe on 79, whatever. If you're finding it on some weird random high number port, what does that mean? Like, why would it be there and what are the implications of that?
yeah. Those are great questions. And the reality is that I don't know if we know comprehensively why we are finding so many protocols on non-standard ports, right? There's so many hypotheses for why this might be happening. It could be security through obscurity, like someone set up, for example, web server, and instead of putting it on port 80, they're like, okay, let me make this harder to find. I'm gonna put it on like 2278. And the thing is that you can still find it. It is harder to find, but these things are still exist on the internet. And this is what has been really interesting for me. A couple of years ago. So, quick background, which I know you know, Dennis, but I'll say for the crowd. I geek out about data. I love data. I am constantly thinking about how do we improve our data quality, our data coverage, how do we use that to provide better insights. And the internet measurement community for a long time was like, okay, when we want to do security research, we're going to scan HTTP on port 80, HTTPS on port 443, and then there was some preliminary research that came out a couple years ago that was like, no, the majority of these protocols are on non-standard ports, which shakes up a lot of things, right? It shakes up everyone's mental model about what we should be looking for and where we should be looking for it. Um, and the how is a lot easier to answer, but getting back to your original question of why, I would love to know why. I would love to talk to some of these folks and be like, so why did you put this random ICS protocol on 57132
Is
when
that
the
your
default is
birthday or
502?
yeah?
Yeah. Yeah.
So
So
there could be any number of reasons sort of behind this. It could just be somebody was messing around or trying to hide something but it's not necessarily suspicious like off the bat, right? It could be.
no, no, not necessarily. And that's a really good point. I think there is some research out there that shows there can be vulnerable entities on non-standard ports. But the internet is so vast and large that I think actually when you look at it proportionally, it's not like, oh, 99% of things on non-standard ports, they're just bad. That's just not the case. And there's some use cases where things are more vulnerable. Like if I'll need to go back and relook at this, but if I'm remembering correctly, IoT devices, for example, super prone to vulnerabilities. And IoT devices tend to be on non-standard ports. Like, yes, they're running HTTP, but like then they're just on some random port. So
Yeah.
that's actually getting back to the question of why. One example is that there's a manufacturer who was like, we want our device to not run into any like multiplexing issues. We don't want to run into any issues on the network. We're going to put on some random port, and then when someone sets it up in their home, there's no issues, right? So there's some use cases where it's like, yeah, this set of devices, which is prone to vulnerabilities, also for logistical reasons, it's going to just be on some random ports. But that's more of a correlation and not a causation, right? It's not because they're on non-standard ports, they're vulnerable. But it's like, yeah, the IoT devices are going to be on non-standard ports. They're going to have slightly more vulnerabilities. And so when you look at the data, you see that, but there's so much more context and nuance behind it.
So you mentioned things like ICS too. Is there, I mean, when you're talking about ICS and OT networks and things like that, there's all kinds of just like random protocols that are not things that a normal person is going to run into every day. Do a lot of those protocols have their own sort of like weird distribution across ports as well?
Yeah, yeah. ICS and OT is super fascinating. If there is any OT operator who is watching this, please email me. I would love to talk to you about this actually. This is where, having mixed multi-methods, and this is just like my small research plug, having multi-methods research is so useful because it's like we see the data and we see what's happening, but I really want to go and interview these people and be like, so what led you to put this piece of critical infrastructure on a random port in the 40,000 range? Like, I really would love to know what your use case is. But yeah, so we ran this very short experiment, and actually wrote this up in a two-part blog that's on the Censys blog right now. Where we were like, we have this intuition. We have this intuition. We've read on like blogs on the internet that a lot of ICS devices, a lot of OT operators are talking about standard port plus one. So like if Modbus is on port 502, we were just like seeing posts that were like, oh yeah, just like put on 503, or like manufacturers that were just putting their Modbus default configuration on 503. And so we ran this really small independent scan to be like, of the ICS protocols that Censys scans for, how many are on standard port plus or minus one? Um, and it was a lot more than we anticipated. Like in some cases, our protocol visibility doubled just by looking at standard port plus or minus one, which is a huge outcome. We didn't anticipate that actually. We were like, oh,
Yeah.
we'll find like 10 devices. No, no, no. Thousands of devices just on standard port plus or minus one. Um, and so this led us to an additional experiment, because then the natural next question, which I think you were alluding to, is like, what are the other hot spots of ports, right? So it's like standard plus or minus one, but like, is there some, is Modbus just going to always be on like 510, for example? But unless we scan the entire 65K port space or all 65,000 ports on the internet, we would never find it. And so we ran a very limited 65K port scan for these ICS protocols. And we did actually find that there are other unanticipated hotspots of ports for some of these ICS protocols. And then this all comes back to the alluring question of why. Like I'm like, is it that a lot of these OT operators are it's a very close-knit community, and so they've decided as a standard to put all of like this one protocol on a port that's not even related to the RFC? Is it that one manufacturer decided and that's just what the default is in the configuration? I mean, I would love to know. Sorry a little bit for that ramble. As you can tell, I get really excited about this.
That's why I love talking to you. Um, I wonder, my like naive assumption when I read through your blog post was kind of what you just described of like the operators just sort of like, you know, over time kind of decided like, hey guys, we're meeting over here. Like we used to meet at this one restaurant on Thursday
Yeah,
nights, but that place is whack, so we're gonna move it to this restaurant. Like it's less crowded, like, we can get a table. Like
I
that kind
love
of
that. I love that analogy. That is my leading hypothesis. It's like, hey, everyone knows Modbus is on 502. What if we just didn't put it on 502? And what if it just made that a little bit harder for um, external folks to find those things, right? It's like, because at the end of the day, we're all just trying to stay safe. And so actually leaning into this restaurant analogy, it's like we're not going to go to the popular restaurant because everyone knows to find us at the popular restaurant. We're going to go like four streets over, so that we can still, chit chat and share the news, but they can't find us there. That's
yeah.
exactly it.
Do you have a sense of whether adversaries are using this kind of reasoning, maybe isn't the right word, but technique as well, like moving things on to random ports just to avoid detection?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll give uh we've done some preliminary analysis and more will come out in a couple of weeks or months after this chat. But we've done some preliminary analysis specifically around like some C2s. So like command and control devices. They or command and controls will infect devices, and we can see signatures for different families, like Cobalt Strike, for example. And Cobalt Strike, there's a lot on 80, there's a lot on 443, but actually within the census data set, as well as based on some independent measurements, we have found a number of Cobalt Strike signatures across a wide range of ports. And the reasoning is the same, right? It is, hey, everyone knows to find us at this restaurant. We're just going to go down the street. And it is a really useful evasion technique. Like I can't deny that, but it's not perfect. There are tools to help find those things. There are data sets to find those entities. And, if you look hard enough, you'll find it. And we have. So I'll leave it with that, a little bit of that teaser.
But there's no like standardized way that you could sort of look at it and say cobalt strikes should be here, but maybe they're over here or over here. You just kind of have to do the scan, be like, okay, we found it all over the place.
Yeah, exactly. And also because like, I mean, attackers and defenders, everyone is constantly changing their techniques. So like it may be the case today that we see a hot spot or a concentration on a specific port, and then in 6 months that'll change because people's techniques are changing, their tactics are changing, they're shaking it up. And again, it is a technique that works fairly well. But you can still find it. You just have to keep putting in the time and the effort to do so.
So from a defender's point of view, if you're, say you're used to seeing cobalt strike traffic coming from a specific port or whatever, like how do you kind of adapt yourself to, or what can you do to be like, okay, things could be coming from anywhere. It's not necessarily located on one specific port these days.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. I think one useful technique is not pigeonholing yourself into previous trends, right? Or another way to say it, instead of saying I'm going to inspect all the traffic from port 80 that's incoming to my firewall, my box, whatever,
Yeah.
and investigate the signatures based on that pre-filtering. Instead, you may need to look at, the entirety of the traffic and look at filtering at a much, or not filter, but looking for the signature at a much larger scale. Now we're talking about issues with scale, right? I mean, especially if you're a defender at an organization, at an enterprise, you're getting a lot of traffic. I know. I'm really sorry. Like I'm part of the problem. But um it's really not falling into, these preconceived notions or assumptions. It is expanding what is possible in the world, which also means trying to expand our capabilities of how we're looking for these signatures, where we're looking for them. Um, yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, what else, like what's next? You said that you've got some new stuff coming like down the road, but is there anywhere else that you want to push this research in the next few weeks, months?
Yeah, one thing that's constantly on my mind, right, because I'm a researcher, I love doing these one-off experiments and whatnot.
Yeah.
But then the question that I'm always thinking about, especially, as a member of Census, is how do we bring this back to a system-wide scale? Because at the end of the day, we could run 65K port scans constantly all the time, but that's not great as an internet citizen, right? And as a
No.
researcher, I can do a one-off scan, and that's not contributing a lot of noise to the internet, and I'm not, bombarding enterprise defenders with multi-hour 65K port scans. But then when you're talking about a system level scale, you get into some really interesting questions. It's like, how do we find as much as we can on the internet without completely bombarding people's networks, people who need to do the filtering of the data for their own purposes. And so it's this really interesting balance that we're having a lot of internal conversations about, of how do we try and find everything that we can, while also being respectful, and also recognizing that like the internet is large.
Yeah, and it keeps growing. It's not going to shrink.
I know. You know, actually, to that point, Dennis, it's kind of interesting. The internet is growing. I do think more has been added, especially in the case of like ICS and these recent findings. I'm like, how much of it was just there and we hadn't found it before? Um,
This is something I would ask you. Yeah. I and like as an elderly person,
oh
I
no,
remember the internet as like a small thing that you could literally like be like the internet, you could almost you put your arms around it, like it's AOL and it's Prodigy and these services. And now it's literally like the appliances in my kitchen and it's your TV,
yeah,
it's every single thing. It's your car, all that kind of stuff. So um I do feel like there's just like large portions of it that even we haven't found yet, even.
yeah. You know what? I might need to go and do some digging after this call because my gut here. This is without. I try to back everything I say with some sort of data, but my gut in this situation is that there's a lot that's new. Um, there's probably a sizable portion, especially in the case of like these long-standing devices, older protocols, specifically like I'm thinking about ICS, for example, that have been around. And up until a couple years ago, we were like, well, we're just going to scan them on their standard port. They're not there, so they must not be on this network. And it's like, no, actually, they were on this network. Um, I'm not going to put a number behind it, but it is an interesting idea. It's something that I think about a lot too. It's like the internet grew a lot, and how much of that growth is actually just us understanding more about what's going on.
Right. Yeah. I think you would know better than I would, but I think that it's got to be a significant non-trivial chunk of that. We're just getting better at finding things, you know.
Yeah,
Um
yeah.
yeah.
You know what? This is intriguing. I think there's a couple ways actually to try and measure this. Stay tuned. I'm gonna go do some poking. I'll let you know what I figure out. It digs into this question of like how do you date an entity on the internet, which has its own intricacies and measurements and data issues. But I think there's some interesting workarounds. I might be poking at this and pinging you again.
Oh, interesting. Great. Well, I'm glad I made more work for you.
Yeah, I know. This is what we all want.
Ariana, thank you so much for your time. This is really fascinating research.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dennis. It was great chit chatting, and I appreciate your time.
All right. Talk to you soon.
Likewise.